last year, about this time, I was asked to give a presentation at a national nutrition conference in Medellin, Colombia. And I was asked to talk about the nutrition transition, which we'll talk about in a minute. And as I got to learning more about that literature and preparing the presentation, and then had the chance to visit Colombia, some of the elements really came through about the interdependency of our food system. And so we're talking here today about sustainable food systems, but as Mr. Ryan told us, our food system is really quite international, and we need to think about it as we're trying to move to be more sustainable. What are the effects that could be positive or negative on other people's food supply as well? And if we think about the role of history in our current system, we remember that far back, we used to have a fairly short food chain. We grew it, we ate it. Or our neighbor grew it and we traded, chickens for potatoes and we ate it. And it was primarily in the 20th century that we developed a more complex food system and then over time we got into about the middle of the Depression and whatever, we started to get more processed foods and the like. But until then, families and communities were fairly independent in lots of ways. And in some senses, our move towards local sustainable systems is kind of a return to that, or aiming for that in a sense. And if you all are ever interested in an interesting book, it's called Food of a Younger Land by Mark Kurlinski. And somebody dug out a whole bunch of WPA projects from the Depression where they were trying to support writers as well as artists and things that we might have heard about. And so writers wrote up these vignettes about food in local areas in various states. And it actually is talking a lot about food before we had processed food, which most of us haven't lived where that's the case. So it's kind of interesting that we're, in some small ways, trying to return to that in a very different world. I think if we, take a look at globalization, which affects all of us, whether we live here in the US or in other developed countries or in those in less developed countries, it does lead to changes in the agriculture and food systems, and it has done that, which is going to lead to changes in the food quantity, type, cost, and desirability. Some of these are positive, some of these are less positive. This leads to changes in food access and availability by changes in how we produce food, how we get it, and how we distribute it. And this, in turn, can lead to changes in food culture and changes in dietary patterns and subsequently nutritional status. So it can get kind of complicated. But all of these things tend to kind of cascade down one to the other. And I talk about changes in food culture. I can remember telling people saying, well, you mean you make your own spaghetti sauce? Well, yeah, I'm old enough. I grew up when people made their own spaghetti sauce. Our food culture now is that you buy it in a jar. So we've had those sorts of changes and things to come with it. Is it good? Maybe are we having a more varied diet? Perhaps. Is it cheaper? Possibly. But I personally think I lose something if I don't make my own spaghetti sauce. But it does change our whole culture and how we approach food. And it does affect our nutritional status. One of the effects of globalization, and it's mostly happened, in the last 20 years, is this whole idea of trade liberalization. And this came back, if you want to go back into remote sorts of things, you get the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade or whatever that was, and that led to the World Trade Organization, et cetera, making these changes. But there were efforts to reduce tariffs that countries did on food. There were reductions in import quotas so that you could import more easily into different countries. We provided export incentives, and then we also have in there price supports and subsidies in order that contribute to the incentives. And so trade liberalized, and that's when we started being able to get strawberries and asparagus in January, which for those of us who like those foods is really good. And then we stop and think about where it came from and how long it took to get there and how much fuel it takes, and some of us stop and think again. But anyway, so that it also led to these free trade agreements. And these agreements have generally been proposed by people in the North, in the more developed world, often to countries in the less developed world. And that allows for free trade back and forth. Most of us have heard of NAFTA, and that was an example here in the US, and it's had some positive effects and some less positive effects. The other thing that happens with the free trade agreements and the trade liberalization is that in the past, most countries didn't allow other companies from other countries to invest in them particularly. And you couldn't hold more than a 49% ownership of a company in another country. That has changed, and so we've had a lot of our American food companies working and investing in and developing in less developed countries as it relates to agriculture. And that's positive because it can provide jobs, it certainly can increase people's income in those countries, and I think that can be really good. But at this point in time, we actually developed country food companies often own, and they make more of the food in country than they actually export to those countries. And so there's some good things about foreign direct investment, but there are also some things that may not be as positive. And then there's also been this huge change in marketing and advertising because in Kenya, where they may not have land-based telephones, people do make their bank deposits on their cell phone. They get ads on their cell phone. And what do they learn about? They learn about various developed country food products that they see on TV, on our programs that are on their TV sets. And so it becomes really quite complicated. And then we also have this much greater integration of products, production, and markets, which likewise, like most things in life, has both a positive and a negative effect. I'll back up just a second to say I'm just barely touching the surface of some of this stuff. We could have a whole course. We don't have a whole course today. I know we want to get to our tea break or whatever it's going to be. Anyway, so there are some potential sustainable food system effects. It certainly can lead to more monocultures of particular crops, such as corn. I recently had the privilege of visiting an indigenous group in the Malaysian part of Borneo. And we traveled 4 or 5 hours by car, and then took another 45 minutes up a river to this nearby indigenous group in Borneo. And was kind of surprised. We had to take most of our own food, but I was really kind of surprised to find that their favorite vegetable was corn. Now, corn's good food. I don't argue with that. Everybody here enjoys food. We're heading into the corn season. But I didn't expect to find it in remote parts of Malaysia. And I think that just talks, that can lead to issues when we only have a few crops, as the example from the president's garden versus the commodities garden. It does reduce biodiversity, and it also can have adverse effects on local farmers. Because of NAFTA, for example, it's often cheaper for us to ship corn to Mexico, and that puts in danger Mexican farmers who no longer have a good market for their corn because it's more expensive. So that it does have effects on local farmers who by and large haven't been done by large commercial farms. Certainly have raising cash crops rather than feeding families and communities, and the resultant loss of local habitat, soil, and impacts on the environment. We see that with various things. It means that we do have cacao, and I would be the #1 chocolate lover if we had a race here. But at the same sense, it does have an impact on the local on the local economy and the local food, because families that used to have a very active role in raising their own food are now raising a cash crop, and the people who don't have land get moved to urban areas where they don't have access to food either. So it does have can have a large effect. Unfortunately, most of these advantages of free trade and globalization are for people like us and not for people in developing countries. And I think one of the things that we need to think about, and that part of drives why we're in public health, is this whole idea of equity and social justice. And so we need to think about that. And so my purpose here is just to start you thinking about some of that. But I think, you know, that is an issue that of the potential for unfairness that seems to be seen. And then we, likewise, if we're thinking about sustainability, we have this whole idea of a finite quantity of renewable and non-renewable resources that comes into play as well. And are we going to use somebody else's resources so we can save ours? Anyway, just things to think about. Other sorts of things, we certainly have increased imports. As I say, we enjoy that asparagus in January, or some of us don't buy it quite as often as we used to. But less developed countries also have access to additional foods that have been imported, and that can be good. But I was really surprised to find a McDonald's in a Medellin shopping center, and people flocking to it when they were not eating their wonderful fish and seafood and other sorts of locally grown products that they'd lived with for centuries. So just good things and bad things. The whole idea of a short food versus a long food chain, and most of the traditional food chains were fairly short. And so what we find is that in lots of less developed countries, people may be losing this local seasonal aspect of their food chain and having an increased use of what are called value-added processed foods. And if you go into the store, actually a couple of years ago I was in Mexico conducting research in a remote indigenous village. I'm interested in nutrition transition and how people change with migration. Anyway, so I expected to find things, and it was a very limited diet. They had corn, they had beans, there were a few chilies, a few tomatoes. That was basically it. I go into the store, I look in the trash, what do I see? The Maruchan instant noodles. Well, I didn't expect to find noodles there, but that's that value-added processed food that's looked for, but may not have been really providing too much but calories to that very poor population. So it's something to think about. We certainly have more, I mentioned that we have more food company sales from foreign direct investment in less developed countries than from exports. And then this whole idea of foreign direct investment has led to the global spread of supermarkets. Excuse me. Thank you, Jim.
You're welcome.